There we are.
Okay, we're on. I'm Jeff, and we've got Job and Luke,
Hiya.
and we're doing an experiment. We're gonna do a book reading and some of our commentary and our thoughts on it. And the book that we're focusing on is A Grief Observed, written by C.S. Lewis. And Job, do you want to say a little bit about how this came about?
Yes, I happened to find myself in a religious bookstore. This is a new experience to me. And there was just this tiny book in Dutch, Verdriet, Dood en Geloof, which means, I guess, verdriet. Oh man, now I can't think of the English word. I should have prepared better. Verdriet is tears, sadness, death, and faith is basically what it's translated as. And it's a book that grabs you. I ended up just reading in one sitting. It's so existential. And I'm just reading this, and I keep every paragraph I read, like, I got to talk to somebody about this. And as I keep having that same thought with each paragraph, I figure I should just do the whole book with some other people. And so I approached Jeff, and then we were like, well, let's get Luke involved, and maybe we can do this sort of YouTube reading. And well, here we are. And we'll see where this goes, I guess. So what I've personally done is I've added some notes as far as I could to the paragraphs of the book, starting at chapter 1 for the entire first chapter. And what we could do is just I start reading the first paragraph and then my comments, and then we go from there. And whenever we're ready for the next paragraph, we go to the next paragraph. And how long that takes we'll see.
All right, I think that's good. There was one thing that I wanted to throw in, but before I do, Luke, do you want to say anything before we get started?
Nope. I'm excited, and I love you both.
Ditto. Just a little background for anybody who isn't familiar with the book or hasn't read it. I'm not going to give a ton of background, but it's written by C.S. Lewis. When it was originally written, he wrote it under a pseudonym. I think it was more of a journal, and he didn't want it to be, it wasn't thought of as something that would ever be published, as far as I understand it. So it's very raw, it's very intense, and it's off the heels, or it's him processing the death of his wife, Joy Davidman Lewis. And if you want to get a little bit of a backstory, it's not, from what I've heard, it's not like a fully accurate representation of the truth of the events that happened between him and his wife. But there's a movie starring Anthony Hopkins playing C.S. Lewis called The Shadowlands. So that can give you a little bit of context around what happened leading up to her death and after her death. So I enjoyed the movie. I know that Job's seen the movie and he enjoyed it. Luke, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but that's just a little bit of maybe a primer if somebody wants to look more into this.
Yeah, that was a tough watch, but very well made. I mean, Hopkins is just, yeah.
Yeah.
I can start reading for all
Let's
good.
do it, Job.
Let's do it.
All
Dive
right,
in.
let's go. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. My comments with this paragraph are, well, I recognize this feeling as anxiety. The throat closes up, the metallic taste of adrenaline on the tongue, and the tension makes you swallow and yawn. So yeah, when he wrote that, like, oh, that's like this thing that holds you and constricts you almost. I don't have whole epistles for each paragraph. Usually just some notes.
Yeah. So a couple, I want to start with a broader comment about this book. I just read the first chapter in preparation for this, and it's been a long time since I read it. I've spoken with Jeff before about how sometimes reading books at different periods in your life, it's like, you're a completely different person. So the way that it strikes you is a lot different. And I have not had someone really close to me die yet, but yet I think being somewhat of an empath, being a 4 on the Enneagram, I can relate. I think, if you don't know what an Enneagram is, sorry. They're the highly emotional people. I can relate to a lot of feelings, and I get a lot of it through movies. And what happens to me, what related to me about this paragraph is the swallowing and the yawning and the fear. It's like I relate it to experiences I've had watching movies or reading books. And what happens to me a lot of times when I feel that depth of an emotion, it's like you can't breathe. It's really, and I mean, which is really, if you think about it in like a bar field kind of a way, it's like like your heart or your spirit, the breath, has been removed from your body. You can't get your breath. You can't breathe. It's physically difficult to breathe. And I don't know, that was the main thought that I had in that paragraph, and the way that I would relate. And I have no idea what it would be like to lose someone that close. I mean, you can't fathom it. Through reading this first paragraph, I was obviously thinking about my wife, and this is the last thing I'll say. I'll try not to talk forever, but there's a song recently of an artist I really like. His name is Jason Isbell, and the song is called "If We Were Vampires," which sounds weird, but it's a beautiful song, but it's kind of a play on, if we were vampires and death was a joke, we would, but the really like emotional and touching part of the song is that there's a lyric of saying, like, it's essentially about one of us is going to go first. Death is real. Death isn't a joke. And it's essentially a love song, but in this really weird reverse way about death and about the impending pain of losing a loved one. And so, and I can't fathom it. I mean, it's almost, my wife and I talk about it sometimes, about almost, I would jokingly say, like, I hope I go first, but in a sense, I'll probably just start crying anyhow. But in a sense, because I love her, I would rather have her die first, because I don't want her to go through that.
Yeah.
Which, I don't know. It's all, love's a weird thing. Grief is a weird thing.
Yeah. And that's what this book does a lot. It really confronts you with those thoughts you kind of know you have.
Yeah.
And it forces you to go through them. Yeah,
which is what beautiful art does. And what's so touching about this book is that it wasn't meant to be so it's really just his journal. I mean, it's raw.
Yeah.
And it's one of the most real things that you'll read, I mean, it's intimate.
Yeah, that paragraph, the yawning and the swallowing, I got hung up on those because I couldn't connect with it. And then I had to go back and read the paragraph again. And when he talks about the fluttering of the stomach, that's where I was able to latch onto, because he talks about this in one of his other essays, like the fluttering of the diaphragm. It's the same physiological response when you are anxiously excited about something, when you're anticipating something that you really want to happen. It's that same feeling, but it's a completely different texture when it's a negative anxiety or a negative, dreadful experience. And I do remember, the closest that I have been to the experience that I've had to what he is talking about is, you would always be hit with that fluttering, with that fluttering of the stomach. Or I would feel that. And then another feeling that I would have is, just in the grief, I would remember thinking, I just don't want to live anymore. I remember just being deep in prayers and just crying out to God and just saying, I don't want to live this existence. And none of it was in the territory of actually, wanting to act out self-harm or anything like that. But it was just, this is such pain that I just don't want anymore. And I remember many times just in prayer praying that, and just falling asleep, just having sleep overcome me, and then waking up and just feeling just a fraction better. So it's almost like the death of sleep. I was getting an answer to my prayer in that sense, where I could die to that moment, but then wake up again.
This is going to be a very rough book read.
We're only one paragraph in.
I know. I mean, and I don't mean it as a joke,
Yeah.
although it makes it easier for me to talk about it. But man, yeah, I've been fortunate enough that I've only had grandparents pass, but I can't possibly imagine. But yeah, the book will surely press us to go there further. I can continue to the next paragraph.
Yeah, let's do it.
At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting, yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me. I said, well, depression, you ragged, clawed, smothering thing. You feel disconnected, but you don't want to be alone. Being alone is worse. Then you're just alone with your thoughts. You want others to exist, but they shouldn't be aware that you yourself exist. Because that way you're alone, but you don't risk that they'll talk to you, because you might not be able to answer in the shit that you are, for lack of a better word. But it just reminds me of when I would be in a particularly nasty depressive episode. I'd be around people, like at the fire department, and we'd be at the bar after training, kind of chatting, and my mind's just full of kill yourself already. And that was better to just be around my fellow firefighters while wanting to kill myself than to be at home on my own wanting to kill myself, because then at least you're around other human beings. That's what it made me think of. Like, he craves companionship, but he doesn't crave the attention that it might bring.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliantly said. I think because I don't know. I haven't ever had that significant of depression. Like I've maybe shared, I don't know if I've said this to you, Joe, but I don't think I've maybe shared with Jeff. I've only been had serious suicidal thoughts once in my life, but depression is definitely an area where I think what's weird about it, and grief is probably similar, in where you want, what you're craving in a sense is connection, is oneness, is unity. This thing that essentially you've lost the deepest connection, the deepest human connection that you had, for instance, in a spouse. And I think you're craving that back. But what is so hard, at least for people who are wired like me, is I also just because I love intimate and real human connection, authentic, earnest human connection so much, I despise superficial human connection. And I think when you're going through grief, people are around you, and that level of intimacy and realness and rawness, I think, terrifies people, because we're all equally desirous of, but yet fearful of, that kind of connection and that kind of transparency. Because it I mean, you're vulnerable then, when people,
yeah.
And I think when you're around people that are like that, you're probably somewhat subconsciously afraid of that kind of intimacy with anyone, because you've just been bereft of that. But then at the same time, people don't know what to say to you. You know, he'll talk of that later.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to know what to say to someone experiencing that level of trauma. And so, you know, he says later, and we'll maybe get there, like he almost admires the young people who just red-faced come up and say like, you know, I'm sorry, and then just go away quickly because they've done their duty, but then they just leave you alone. Because it is hard to know what to do with people. It's probably, I was thinking when I read this that it's almost best probably to just, and I've heard people going through pain to say that, just be in the same room, just be there, don't say anything.
Yeah, and just, let's say he would sit, let's say Lewis was here and he'd sit with us and we'd just be talking, and
Sure.
we act like he's not there, and while that's harsh in any other context,
yeah,
but you acknowledge their grief, but you don't patronize it, basically.
yes, yeah.
And people don't know what to say, right? Yeah. So people, I think, who are more thoughtful are the ones who are like, I really don't know what to say, so I'm going to say as little as possible. Like for me, I have gone to funerals before, and really the only thing that I feel comfortable doing, even if comfortable is the right word, is if somebody, you know, is open to it, I'll give a hug, and that's about it. Like when I go to funerals, I start to well up, just empathizing the other people's grief, even if it's someone that I've never met before. Like I went to a funeral last week of a very dear friend of mine who lost a family member, and I had never seen my friend cry before. And, you know, that's all that I wanted to do even before I saw my friend. And it's just, I don't know. It's like, it's kind of the weep with those who weep. And it's not like I was cognitively thinking, okay, I need to start weeping with those who weep. It was just something that I felt like was overcoming me. And being someone who's experienced grief, I can also experience the death of a loved one. I can also understand the position I think that Lewis was communicating, which is, I think he either does it later in the book, or maybe this was something that I saw in the movie that we referenced earlier, but, or maybe it wasn't him at all. But I've heard people say, you know, the things that people say to me don't help. I know that they mean well, but they don't know what's going on. I don't even know what's going on. And so I really feel sensitive to that for people who are going through it. Like I've had a friend who lost their significant other just tragically at a young age. And the only thing that I could really do, you know, I said, I know that I can't say anything to you that's gonna make any difference or that's gonna help or anything like that. And this might sound dumb, but I just want to read you a passage from this book. And I pulled this book out that we're talking about, and it's later on. We'll get to it. Maybe I'll remember it when we hit it. But she just started weeping, and I said, "Here, this is your copy. I bought it for you. I just want you, you know, if you want to read it, read it. Don't. But I think this might be the closest to you feeling like there's somebody else who's felt what you're going through."
Yeah. I think I'll just go to. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, it just speaks to the deficiency of words, particularly, and maybe Lewis says this later, but maybe poetry could help. Something like this could maybe help. But yeah, it's probably, I feel like there's some really good poetic short statement I'm forgetting right now about the limitation and deficiency of words sometimes. But anyhow, yeah, let's go on, Joe.
Okay. There are moments, most unexpectedly, when something inside me tries to assure me that I don't really mind so much, not so very much after all. Love is not the whole of a man's life. I was happy before I ever met age. I have plenty of what are called resources. People get over these things. Come, I shan't do so badly. One is ashamed to listen to this voice, but it seems for a little to be making out a good case. Then comes a sudden jab of red-hot memory, and all this common sense vanishes like an ant in the mouth of a furnace. I thought to myself, okay, so you lived just fine before the antidepressant. Surely you can go back to existence. You lived just fine as a nihilist atheist. Surely you can do without religion. Man up, Lewis tells himself. Stiff upper lip, chop chop. It's like we don't want ourselves to grieve. Surely we can go back to how we used to be. This shouldn't be a problem. But we underestimate the feeling of absence of things once held. It's of course there was the pre-marriage state, but the pre-marriage state now has the surrounding context of the post-marriage. Well, you know what I'm saying. It's reflecting back on, I didn't have this thing, and now it's fine to go back to not having that thing. Well, yeah, that was before you had the experience of having the thing. So seeing Lewis, despite all his grief, still trying to tell himself, snap out of it, man, that's just brutal. Like, that's the last thing.
It's like pretending what is isn't. It actually reminds me of I don't know, and this is, I mean, it's maybe appropriate because it's Lewis, but it reminds me of a couple things from the Space Trilogy, which I will continue harping on till the end of time. But there's two things that popped out to me is Lewis, sorry, I don't know if you can hear
right. That's wonderful to hear in the background.
Lewis in the, I think these are both from Perelandra, but he talks about the voluble self, which is the chatty, I didn't know that word, Lewis, frequently he's increasing my vocabulary, but the chatty self, the talkative voice inside your head is something he references toward the end of Perelandra, which he learns to distinguish. The main character, Ransom, learns to distinguish toward the end of that book, and he learns to distinguish between himself, his real self, and the voluble self is what he calls the chatty mind that's just always talking in his head, which isn't necessarily you. You know, we don't know where that mind comes from. So this passage reminds me of that. You know, the voice that says, "Oh, you were fine before her.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you'll go back and you'll do." To me, that's exactly what Lewis means by the voluble self. It's just this chatty head. It's not necessarily telling you anything true. And that's what I think we need to be discerning of. So that's one thing. But then it's also the idea from Perelandra where the Eve character is having a dialogue with someone, and he's trying to convince her that she could have an expected good that she could hold on to, because she would expect something, but then see that the actual thing is different than what she'd expected. And he's trying to convince her that she could hold on to her affections, her desire could hold on to the expected good rather than the real good that came to her. So what happened to illustrate that? That's an abstract idea, not to go on too long of a tangent, but
that's all right.
Ransom, the main character, is this guy that shows up on her island, and there's these floating islands. It's on Venus, and so the whole planet's ocean, and there's floating islands. And so he's approaching her from a distance, and she sees him from a distance, and she's all excited, and she sees him coming, but that's because she had expected him to be the king, this other man that's on the island somewhere that they had been separated and lost. But then when he gets close enough for her to see really what's going on, she recognizes that it's not him, and then she's surprised, but then she's like, oh, that's fine. But then what happens is the deceiver character comes in and Ransom is having a conversation with her, and he's like, he essentially can't understand why she was not disappointed, why her desire wasn't just like, this wasn't the king. But that's because she didn't have the whole point of this thing is that this character she's not yet fallen and broken to the extent, this is the whole brilliance of what Lewis tries to illustrate, is that she yet didn't know that you could still attach your desire to the thing that you had expected versus the real thing that appeared, which essentially creates angst and agony and loss and different things. So it's almost like, it's almost what I think of as Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but your will. He's like, I'm not going to hold on to the thing that I want, but ultimately I'm going to submit to the good that I can't yet even fully comprehend and understand, even though I know it's going to hurt, because you are greater. Because that's the faith trust dynamic of how I think this whole thing in relationships work, and our relationship with God, is that ultimately there is that peace that passes understanding that Paul talks about in the New Testament, which is a trite thing to say to someone who is suffering. I'm talking about this now in a very abstracted, distanced way. Like, I probably am not even going to be believing this if I would tell this to myself when I experience grief.
Right.
But I think ultimately it's true. And I think ultimately when you process through those things and you're somehow held secure, even though it sounds trite, in the arms of God, and you endure this suffering, whatever it is, I think that's the crucible that you endure, and you come out on the other side with hope that whatever it is better. That's essentially what faith and hope is that it is the ability to endure that kind of trauma without saying, this isn't worth it.
Yeah, that's something that certainly comes back in this book, as far as I can tell.
So sorry, that was a really long tangent, but it's, and I don't even know that you can get yourself, you probably can't get yourself intellectually even there in a place like that. It's too existentially real in the moment. You can't extract yourself to just, tell yourself this kind of stuff and be comforted by it.
I found that certain things can be rationally reached, and I'm not surprised that this is not within ration either.
Yeah.
Yeah, that section of the book, that paragraph right there, it made me think of two things. One is, experiencing that, I do remember telling myself, hey, you were living a perfectly fine life before you ever had this thing in your life, right?
Yeah.
And it was fine. And anything that you experience, I think, like you were saying, Joe, yeah, well, that was before this thing had happened to me. It's forever changed everything that goes back into the beginning of my existence, and it's going to be a part of everything that goes forward. It is an I don't know if eternal is the right word, but it basically, one way of saying is it infects. Infect is maybe the wrong word, but
yeah.
All of these are negative connotations. It taints. There are probably positive versions of these words too. Lewis in Mere Christianity refers to Christianity itself as a good infection, and so it infects. But if it's love, it infects in a good way, both forward and backwards, and it's why grief is so powerful, because it means so much. It has the loss of this person, and even sometimes when it's like desires that you were really hung on, things that you really wanted, dreams that you had, when those things die, that impacts the totality of your being, or at least that's been my experience. So that was the first thought from that passage, and then the second is just a reminder of one of the things I love so much about Lewis, that last sentence, and just the imagery that's in that sentence and the poetry that's in there. then comes a sudden jab of red hot memory. And that is so real. That is such a grand way of expressing what it actually feels like. And then he goes on to say, just that picture, you know, all this common sense vanishes like an ant at the mouth of a furnace. You know, you just, you picture that. And it's just like, that's right. That is just something so powerful, consuming something so fragile and small.
Yeah.
Seeing it snuff out and just disappear from existence in an instant.
It's like you build walls of paper. It's pointless.
Yeah, those are your rational conceptual constructs that you would tell yourself, or that this is why the people in the room talking to you is essentially so worthless, is because all those words, all those constructs, all that rationale, all the comfort that you would get through those things are nothing to the reality in and of itself.
Yes, the underlying thing is still there in all its rawness, and it's not going to go away, not a bit.
You can't just throw words at it and have it go away. You know, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
So.
On the rebound, one passes into tears and pathos, maudlin tears. I almost prefer the moments of agony. These are at least clean and honest. But the bath of self-pity, the wallow, the loathsome, sticky, sweet pleasure of indulging in that disgusts me. And even while I'm doing it, I know it leads me to misrepresent age herself. Given that mood its head, and in a few minutes I shall have substituted for the real woman a mere doll to be blubbered over. Thank God the memory of her is still too strong. Will it always be too strong? To let me get away with it. That will it always be too strong? That's a worry right there. In my book, the Dutch translation says maudlin tears, sentimental tears. I don't know if that's exactly the same thing. Just found it interesting that the Dutch would call them that. It seems to me that Lewis tries to retreat to existential pain. That's real. That's true. That's right here. And self-pity is that thing that makes you feel weak, and existential pain makes you feel combative and challenging, and you're contending with reality. You're facing it head on instead. Oh, woe is me. And it reads to me like Lewis's wife sometimes becomes like this great shining angel towering over him, and he just tries to reach to it, but that's not who she was. She was like him. Bit dramatic. She was like a facade, a paper mache wrapping around decay and death. I guess I felt kind of dramatic when I wrote that, but it is that oh, she was this great thing. No, she was also this self-aware chemical reaction that you were, and that reflects on you as also being this vulnerable, decaying, dying thing. But yeah, that's all I got for this one.
Well, as I understand it, he saw her and he experienced her as a worthy adversary. That was one of the things I think that attracted him to her. There's a book that Paul Vanderklay mentioned that he read, which was a biography on her, which just sounded fascinating the way that he described it. It's on my reading list. I really need to. It's one of the books that I want to read as I'm continuing to either reread the Lewis books that I've read before or finding all the ones that I haven't. But yeah, that's the impression is, and that's what I get out of this is he's reminding himself, no, she would not be blubbered over like this. If she were sitting right here, she'd basically smack me in the face rhetorically and say, what are you doing? Who are you turning me into? So I found that very, very real. And then you can also sense his fear in there that, oh my gosh, I might lose I've already lost her. I might lose who I know her to really be as my memory of her starts to fade.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Yeah, that's a better interpretation.
That's my, that's probably, I remember in reading through this book and even rereading what I read in prep for this is that, I don't know, what's so weird and who knows how I will feel in the real experience of this if it ever happens someday, but like with my wife, I think I'm almost more afraid of my continuing life without her and then the loss of an accurate memory than I am of her death in and of itself. And I say that, and maybe that's not true. Maybe that's just the way I feel now. But I do say that, I think, because I think I honestly do believe in a resurrection. And so her death in and of itself is not the most terrifying thing to me. Me misremembering her in my continued life without her, and like that separation of my memory is almost, I don't know, feels more scary to me. And I what I thought of with this, and I hope this isn't too esoteric, but what it reminds me of, I've been thinking a lot recently about icons, and I think the reason this is poignant and pertinent to this is that later on, I think in this chapter, Lewis talks about even pictures of her and how those misrepresent what she really even looked like a smile, or that little, whatever it is, and maybe I'm misremembering this word, but the nous, the life, the energy, the spirit that's within us, like that's the thing that's lost at death. That's why a lot of times you'll see someone in a casket and it doesn't even look like them.
Yep.
Because whatever it is about like a wry smile, or the glint in their eye, or like the little smirk that they would do that intimately, that maybe other people wouldn't even recognize, but because of countless interactions with this person. Those are the things that I think connect you to the reality and the depth of what that being is, that human being. And I think, and that's why pictures, I think, I've heard Jordan Peterson talk about this with paintings. This is why paintings are different than a lot of times photographs. Like a photographs can rarely capture the essence of a person, whereas paintings, like in a portrait, someone comes in for multiple sittings over the course of a long period of time. And so what a good painter will do is, it's not like a photograph. It's not a moment in time. You're capturing the essence of that person because it's so many sittings. And so that's why a painting almost can look alive, is because it does something different that most photographs can't do. And I think this gets at the idea of what an icon is supposed to be, is that an icon isn't a simple image. It's not a photograph. It's a thing that allows you to look through the image to the deeper thing. Philosophically, that's what an icon is supposed to be. This is why Jesus is the icon of the Father. He's the thing that he's the exact image, is the translation. And that's the thing that I think Lewis was afraid of losing. He was afraid that his memory of her would become a mere photograph versus the depth of what he knew her to be.
A cheap replica.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And that's my fear, is like, and he elaborates on this later, like it will be more of a projection of me, my ideas of her, than her herself. And what is actually really so great about this book is that gets at the heart of what's going on, I think, in the whole Paul Vanderklay, Jordan Peterson discussions, anyhow, philosophically and theologically.
How so?
This is my whole critique of what the West has done. They're worshiping cheap replicas of their mind versus the deeper thing that the egoic intellect can't ever touch. This is why I was just saying this. Sorry, I don't want to go on a super side tangent from a Grief Observed, but this is what I was just talking to our mutual friend, I would guess, Sarah. I was just talking to Sarah about this recently, that I think the whole discussion of what I'm trying to get at in all my conversations with Paul is most aptly got at through the conversation about icons and what icons are. I think the West doesn't understand icons. And I think they've essentially made their ideas in their head. I think they worship the ideas in their head about God versus God. And it's the same thing that Lewis was saying, is like, it's what Lewis was afraid of with H. He was essentially saying, like, I'm going to lose the real thing, and all I'm going to be left with is my projected mental images of what I thought her to be versus what she really was, which is something that in one sense you have, but is also beyond you. It's the thing it's what makes a being a being. It's something that you can't ever fully understand. It's like, the more that I know my wife, in a sense, the more she's a mystery to me. And like, she'll do something and I'll just be like, what was that? You know, it's like, I can't ever fully get her in here. I can't. You know, she's beyond that. And that's what it means to have it's all these things that I say over and over and over, but the truth outside the truth you now understand. The being outside the being you now understand. The experience of that person, that essence outside of what you currently know. It's like, like Michael Polanyi describes it as knowing. The whole paradigm of knowing is, what does he call it? Knowing is I'll think of it. But anyhow, I'm going to stop rambling on that because it's going to become too esoteric and philosophical. And it's more about grief. Like, this gets us existentially at, I think, the heart of what those broader ideas are about.
Well, we construct the proxy of the person through which we communicate, which is an abstraction over them. That's why when they do something we don't expect, we need to adjust the abstraction, and it freaks us out. When 100. They're gone, we're stuck with the abstraction.
Yes.
And that we know that's inaccurate because we know we were still refining it.
Yes. But it's forever that way. When you're interacting with a real being, that goes on forever.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We always have this approach, this limited filter, but at least we get to adjust it.
Yes. The West has confused that for the thing that you can't ever get at.
For the reality. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
100%.
This is not going to be a 4-parter where we do one episode for each. It's not going to happen.
Well, not with me, because I'll just go. I'll start.
I love this. This is exactly what I hoped we would get out of this.
Yeah.
Well, it's. I think, I don't know, and I mean, this is. So hopefully this is helpful to all of us and to anybody else who'd ever watch it. But it's more, I don't want it to be too distracting from just the grief. I think going through something like this is why I would say, like, ultimately, this is what Lewis was trying to talk about between, like, the voluble self, the intellectual self, the abstractions, the guy who thinks in all the abstractions versus the real you. This is like the inner quiet voice. Because, like, all this is stuff that I would argue all of us know this stuff. We all know this, like, at a level that maybe we don't know here, but this is like the heart knowing that if we would shut up this enough, this is why meditation and contemplation is so essential to Christian practice. You gotta shut off the voluble self, to understand these things. And it's the trans-rational knowing.
I'll make a statement that I probably regret making here. But over and over reading this book in preparation for this, or at least over and over reading this chapter, I think this is through reading this chapter, it kind of strips down the layers of assumptions I make about reality, because it confronts you with grief in its pure form. At least it does to me. I think this is the closest I get to feel to God, to that there might be one. Because there seems to be one when I'm just that connected to somebody else's grief.
Yeah.
And this comes back in Lewis's book, like, maybe I'm just hypnotizing myself. Maybe I'm just making all of this up. Yeah.
Well, that's where you got to go back to the common sense the common sense paragraph.
Have we already been there?
Well, that's
The one we just read.
oh, that's the one we just read. But yeah,
Oh,
that's
right before this one, yeah.
That's what I would say is, I would argue that, Job, is your voluble self mind talking yourself out of things that you're coming to realize.
Without going into that too much, I actually don't even know how to respond to that. I think it's more of a, damn it, how do you say this without sounding weird?
Just say it.
It's more of a bare being. There's nothing else that can kind of distract you from realizing that it is right there. And that is when I feel like I'm being held by something. Like, okay, this is all raw and nasty and grief and pain and suffering. Yes, and I know. You were given the shitty car, I know. Oh, don't think I forgot about that one, Jeff.
We should catch Luke up and just share briefly with everybody. It's a reference to a passage from Mere Christianity where Lewis talks about the broader context that he was answering the question of how come people who are Christians, some of them seem like assholes and some of them seem nice. And he tries to explain that a little bit with we start with different raw materials.
Yeah, some of them are assholes. That's why.
We start out with different raw materials, and if you start out with a garbage upbringing, and we're raised by people who just had horrible tempers, and this is kind of what was embedded into you, was built into you from the ground up, so to speak, with the situation that you were in. Keep trying. Do your best. Don't give up. One of these days, you might find that, I get an example that I've used before when I've talked to folks is Major League Baseball players in the United States. Some of them come from countries like the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico, and they grew up impoverished, and they learned to play baseball with literal sticks and rocks. And they became very adept with these very low quality tools to work with. And then once the legit tools were put in their hands, they were just phenomenal. They were leaps and bounds ahead of everybody else who had all of the Louisville Slugger bats and the high quality baseballs that they grew up with from the time that they were playing in Little League when they grew up in America. And the people who grew up with the great tools never made it to the major leagues. But the ones who had to learn how to play with the garbage material were the ones who were just became phenomenal players. And so to me, Job, that's what that passage was talking about more. I know it had a little bit of a different impact on you.
Okay, that's okay. I'm going to pull us back to
sorry.
This is fine. This is great.
I jumped in right there. Sorry.
That's all right. For age, wasn't like that at all. Her mind was lithe. Thank you. Her mind was lithe and quick and muscular as a leopard. Passion, tenderness, and pain were all equally unable to disarm it. It scented the first whiff of cant or slush, then sprang and knocked you over before you knew what was happening. How many bubbles of mine she pricked. I soon learned not to talk rot to her unless I did it for the sheer pleasure. And there's another red hot jab of being exposed and laughed at. I was never less silly than as age's lover. I love this. She was like a mirror. She was like a mirror, and he could see his own like foolishness. And now all he sees is his own reflection, and it's just terrifying because both he's alone.
Yes.
That person, my wife, I do this all the time. I need to bounce some idea. I say, hey, what do you think about this? And she'll just rip it apart. I'm like, great, thank you. Or she'll say, well, there's something to it. But that sort of partner as a soundboard, that's so valuable. I can't imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. When you're saying that and reading this, that actually reminds me. This is something Jordan Peterson has said about finding a spouse. Is, he said you want a peer. You
Hmm.
don't want like a pushover or a lapdog or somebody who's way beyond you. Like, you want someone that you can joust with, that can push you on to be a better you, who can support you, who's a healthy balance of those things. And that's what I think Lewis is getting at with that, because that's what, and even Jeff and you talking about whatever book that is, the auto or the biography of her, in the brief and the superficial descriptions of her that I have, is she was a complex person that you wouldn't, the really superficial understanding that I would say some people who have a cursory knowledge of C.S. Lewis know, if they learned about Joy Davidman, they would say, why did he marry her? Like,
Yeah.
it wouldn't even make sense to them. But yet, I think for somebody like Lewis, who was that brilliant, he didn't want a pushover. He didn't want somebody that was so like him. And I think, that's because ultimately you don't want to marry yourself unless you're a psycho, and like a megalomaniac or something.
Hmm.
Well, he was a well-known author by then as well, and I'm sure he had ample opportunity for sycophants,
Yes.
you know.
Right.
And I haven't read this biography either, but I do get the impression that she kind of, well, that's not true. I was about to say wormed her way in, and maybe some people in Lewis's life would see it that way.
Right.
But Lewis, as I understand it, tried to correspond with every single person that ever wrote him a letter.
Mm.
And so she started as one of his correspondents. And he started pen pal-like friendships. People who would write him very serious letters where they were asking him questions about, their life situations or how they were living their religious lives and things that were just confusing them. And he saw it as his ministry to write back to these people. So he took it very seriously, and he would spend most of his days, a great chunk of his days, writing very meaningful correspondence.
Mm. Yeah, it would have to. I think, like, even what he said, he said her mind was so quick and so tough, and he said, I soon learned not to talk rot to her unless I did it for the sheer pleasure. So he's saying, like, sometimes he did it just playfully, but yet I
Just to
think
see her pounce.
yeah, but what that reminds me of is, like, it almost, having a peer that way who was that bright and quick for Lewis was almost like somebody to hone him, iron sharpening iron out of his. It reminds me again of Jordan Peterson, of his self-deception. Because, like, if you're going to say something that's untrue, even if you're being playful, slightly self-deceived, it reminds me of when Peterson said he came to the realization that 90% of what he said was a lie. Well, if you have someone who's that brilliant, who loves you, who you're talking to, and you throw something out like that, they're just gonna, they're gonna jump all over it.
Yeah.
But what that will do over time, even though in the moment, because my wife does this to me all the time, our minds work so differently. I'm out there in the clouds of abstraction thinking about all this stuff so much, and she's very practical. So I'll just be like, I'll start talking to her about icons and thinking about this stuff, and she'll just be like, and she'll just ask me something really direct and pointed, and I'll just be like, no. But we have to work through that because our minds work so differently, and at times it really irks me, but yet it's very helpful to me in a lot of ways, and it's one of the reasons I love her, is she's not a pushover. Like, I'm not just going to say something where she's just like, that doesn't make any sense.
No, but she
and
wouldn't
just be like, oh yeah.
She wouldn't contend with you like that unless she really loved you. I mean, you
Well,
do that
yeah.
to somebody because you value them.
Yeah.
Right. Man, the times Mallory has taught me, oh man. We started as pen pals, and we wrote to each other for like 8 years before we met. And yeah, that gives ample time for arguing and knowing that, yeah, you're really going to disagree once you're married as well. And that's fine, because Yeah.
That sounds like some really good premarital counseling.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes.
Especially through writing.
Yeah.
All right, let's go, Joe.
All right. And no one ever told me about the laziness of grief. Except at my job, where the machine seems to run on much as usual, I loathe the slightest effort. Not only writing, but even reading a letter is too much. Even shaving. What does it matter now whether my cheek is rough or smooth? They say an unhappy man wants distractions, something to take him out of himself. Only as a dog tired man wants an extra blanket on a cold night. He'd rather lie there shivering than get up and find one. It's easy to see why the lonely become untidy, finally dirty and disgusting. And that's classic depression. Nothing matters anymore. What matters anyway? Why would I bathe or take care of myself? Because that what sustained you, that what made you human, that's gone. The known has turned to the unknown, orders got turned to chaos, but I don't want to make it light of it. I don't want to approach it not seriously. I do think that which sustained him is gone. There's that which gave reason is gone. It's not his friends, not the bar, not his pipes, his reading, his writing, nothing except the time that he'll need to adjust. Because if he's not going to decide that he needs time to adjust, well, then he needs to stop it all. Because otherwise it's going to go on like this forever. So those are dangerous statements to make, but it's easy to see why the lonely become untidy, finally dirty and disgusting. How do you get out? And I can see the draw.
It's hard to care when you don't care.
You can just stay there. I would just drink, and it's very easy to stop showering and stop shaving because who gives a shit? And it's not like you want to talk to anybody. God, what would I do if I was alone? So yeah, that's what this reads like. That's it to a T.
Yeah, it's the line that struck out to me so much was they say an unhappy man wants distractions, something to take him out of himself.
Mm-hmm.
I relate to all that stuff. I don't think to the degree that you've experienced it, Joe, but I definitely relate to that. And this is a personal thing that I've been working through recently is I've always had somewhat of an addictive personality. I mean, I'm that way with anything, with ideas, with food, with relationships. Like, a way that I describe it is I want it all or nothing. And I don't like superficiality. Like, I want all of it. And so, but what that ends up doing, especially relationally, is, at least for me, it leads to a lot of loneliness, because those kinds of relationships and depth are just hard to come by, someone like the kind of, like we were talking about earlier, the depth of relationship you have with a spouse, and with that kind of transparency and realness and rawness, just so few people want it. And it's maybe not because they don't want it, but they're scared. People are scared to go to that level. And that's why, like, even people talk about small talk. Like, I can't do it. I really struggle just because I don't. A lot of guys stereotypically will be really into sports, and I never want to talk about sports, rarely, even though I like them. I just don't care.
Right.
I'm just like, how are you existentially right now in your relationships? That's what I want to talk about. And but what happens, to relate it to all this, and you even said drinking or something, is I've realized over the last few years of my life, I'm also somewhat of like an Epicurean and a hedonist, And so like, I love good food. I love good drink. I love all that stuff. We've talked about whiskey, but what I've found myself on a slippery slope to just being like, my lack of connection, loneliness. Well, it's really easy to have an instant feel good in a glass of whiskey.
Yes.
It's really easy to just be like, oh, well, that's something I can control and that feels good. Like I feel connection. I love the taste. I love the experience. I love the slight feel of levity after a glass of whiskey. But then like that the danger in that is it starts to really bleed, and what you're I mean, and this sounds, I mean, what you're really doing when you consume alcohol at that level is really you're medicating.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
You're
yeah.
using it as a medication for a lack of connection. You're like, I don't connect to people. And you could do that in grief. I mean, it's obvious in grief. And like someone dies. Well, it's obvious when you're drinking then what you're doing. But I've experienced that in a really subtle, slippery way that I've seen a path. I've seen a trajectory where I'm just like, I've come to the slow realization that's like, oh, right now, you're drinking right now, and you're doing it because you're sad.
Mm-hmm.
And you're telling you're doing it because you like it, but really you're sad.
No, that's that's classic addiction coping behavior. I mean, I remember I would wake up and first thought in my mind is, I wonder when I'll be able to get my drink on, so I can kind of get to that state where I don't hear anything and, oh, it's still there, but at least you can kind of ignore it. That is easy. And then you're like, oh, I'm just going to appreciate this whiskey, or I'm going to read a book and have some whiskey. Oh, it's and part of you knows, but it's too easy to just ignore that little cricket on your shoulder, of course. So
it's hard, and that's a slippery slope into, I think this is why, I don't know, with grief or with anything, I mean, processing through it, and this is why human connection and isolation and all those things, and why community and everything, even in grief or even in depression or even in loneliness, and all these things are so important, is because that slope is so subtle and so dangerous that I really do think of life. It's like, I'll keep bringing in Jordan Peterson, but where he says like every decision you make, it's the interconnectedness of all things, is infinite importance. All these choices are infinitely important because they lead you down different paths. If you continue down a path, this slippery slope of medicating with alcohol, that's how you become an alcoholic. I don't,
it's Lewis's heaven hell compass.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. And this is why, I mean, it's such a, I mean, I don't know what the practical takeaway is from that, rather than, I don't know, community, honest participation and transparency and confession and community. I mean, I think this is why all that is this is why meaning. Ultimately, yes, meaning and communion is ultimately the thing that I think protects us from ourselves and from our own extreme isolation and individualism, because that's always the choice, like, am I going to continue in this sadness and like he talks about, like the self-loathing, like that's what I was reminded of earlier when he talks about that.
But it's in there. It's in there. He drinks because he's depressed because he feels he has no purpose. That's how I interpret it. But he says, except at my job, where the machine seems to run as much as usual. At this job, there's a very constrained little purpose of you do the thing.
Yep.
Outside of that, it just falls apart.
Yep.
So
I think this is why grief, and this, I want to hear what Jeff has to say. This is why grief in a book like this is so, I think this is why even Jordan Peterson says, like, almost at the basis of his epistemology is suffering, because it's undeniable. Like a book like this and grief, it's not that suffering is the basis for everything, that's not what I'm saying, but when you're interacting with these kinds of ideas in the way that we are, somehow mysteriously it lends to clarity when you don't avoid it, when you enter into it. because it gets at the heart of how all this stuff works, and there's connection points for everyone. Like maybe I haven't experienced, you know, the loss of a spouse yet, which is like an extreme version of it, or heaven forbid, like the tragic death of a child or something. You know, that's a whole different ball game. But I think it forces you if you want to endure that crucible and not have it destroy you, you can't play games. You can't. Like you have to be ultimately real. That's my idea of what a Christian crucible and suffering and trials and the blessing of that is for the Christian, is that it's your dead wood. It has to be burnt away when you're dealing with those things.
Yep.
Or else you'll be consumed.
It helps you. Let's say that you do allow that dead wood to be burned away, which I feel like I have done in different chapters in my life. When dead wood like that starts to appear to you in other things that are presented to you, other circumstances, other relationships, you're able to point them out right away and just say, you know, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to bring it to the forefront. And if we try to move forward with this dead wood, it's not going to work. It's not alive. It's not going to live. So I'm bringing it up now, and let's light it on fire, you know?
Yes. That's Christian discernment. I would say that's seeing the pattern. Like this is what the Esther Meek thing, which I don't know if I sent to Job or whatever, but I can describe it, but I sent it to Jeff and I know he watched it. This is when you see the snake. Some people don't see the snake. They don't see the dead wood. They don't see this thing that's destroying everything. But you, through your experience, through the grace, through you entering into that suffering in a Christ-like imaging way, voluntarily entering into that suffering, taking on your cross, you start to discern the pattern of superficiality and dead wood. You can see it. And until you do that, you can't see it. This is why the whole point of the Christian thing is to see correctly.
Right. So that's the Christianity that exists across cultures. So all the baggage is irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. It's about seeing correctly. Jesus, if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. And if your eye is evil, divided, your whole body will be full of darkness. This is what he's talking about. You got to see correctly. You got to Peugeot these patterns. You got to learn how to discern these things. This is why, without going on a tangent, but even in that Unitarian discussion, all of the comments on kept being about like the importance of this doctrine and debating the doctrine. And I'm just like, you're all missing the pattern underneath that. It's about how we hold to these patterns and how we go about this. Like you're talking deeper. Further up, further in.
Well, I'm looking at the clock, and I know we've got to stop.
An hour in.
Go to. Yeah. So
I think this might be the first episode of many. Personally, it's a mixture of heaviness and. It's not what I expected how this would go as far as I had any expectation. I think this is great.
Well, let's end it here. I'll stop the recording in just a second, but I'm fully open and interested in continuing the discussion and continuing this project and posting it out there. And whoever wants to watch it can, whether anybody else finds it helpful or meaningful or not. I find it helpful for us, so I want to keep doing it.
Yeah, I love it. It's and I would love to post it because for me, like what I was just describing in my last personal thing about alcohol and disconnectedness and loneliness, these are the kinds of things that combat that for me.
Yeah.
Like like these kinds of conversations, I mean, it's hard to get. Can conversations get much deeper than that? Probably the only way they can is if we were in the situation of actually working through some kind of personal grief in an embodied room together.
Yeah.
Like that's maybe the only way it could get more real.
Yep.
Yeah.
But this is what I want to do all day, every day, is have these kinds of conversations.
Hey,
So
well, we've covered a couple of paragraphs. We've got more ground to walk.
Yep.
Right.
All right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording here, and then let's hang out for just a second before you have to go, Luke.
Yeah, great.
All right.